Nathaniel Carter had spent a decade running from ghosts. Not the kind that rattled chains in the dead of night, but the ones that settled deep in his bones. The kind that whispered when he was alone, that turned the faces in the crowd into memories he tried to forget. He had built a life on distractions, on numbers and deals, on expensive scotch and hotel rooms with views that meant nothing. Yet, on March 22nd, none of it worked. The city stretched beneath him, glittering with false promises. From his penthouse, he could see the skyline of steel and glass, a kingdom he had carved out for himself with relentless ambition. But success had never quieted the past, especially not today. He ran a hand through his neatly combed dark hair and exhaled slowly. It was Naomi's birthday. 10 years. 10 years since he had last seen his sister. 10 years since he had walked away from that house and never looked back. His phone vibrated on the polished marble counter. He ignored it. The scotch in his glass had lost its warmth. He ignored that too. His mind was elsewhere, back in the countryside, where the mansion sat waiting, untouched by time but rotting all the same. Naomi had made one request before she vanished from his life. "Promise me you'll never go back, Nathaniel. Please, just move on." And he had, or at least, he had tried. But tonight, something felt different. It started with a phone call earlier that morning, an unknown number, the kind he usually dismissed. But when he picked up, silence greeted him. A breath, barely audible. And then, a click. It should have meant nothing. Yet, it left a weight in his chest that refused to ease. Hours passed, and the feeling grew. That evening, he found himself in his study, sifting through old belongings he had locked away long ago. He found letters, old photographs of Naomi and himself as children, and a journal with brittle pages. But the thing that unsettled him most was a single envelope at the bottom of the box. It was addressed to him. The handwriting was unmistakable, Naomi's. But the stamp on it was dated 10 years ago. His blood ran cold. He had never seen this letter before. Who had kept it from him? What had she tried to tell him before she disappeared? Nathaniel sat there, staring at the envelope for what felt like an eternity. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink smudged in places, as if written with a shaking hand. "Nathaniel, if you ever read this, I need you to listen. Don't believe what they told you. Please, you have to come back. There's still time. But don't trust." The letter ended abruptly. The bottom half of the page had been torn away. His heart pounded. What had Naomi been trying to tell him? What had happened all those years ago that he had refused to see? For years, he had convinced himself that she had left of her own free will, that she had gone to France, as she had claimed in her last message to him. But if that were true, why would she have written something like this? The answer lay in that house. Nathaniel rose from his chair, the decision made before he could second-guess himself. He grabbed his coat, his keys, and stepped out into the cold night air. The city lights no longer held any warmth. He was going back to the mansion, back to where it all began. And this time, he wasn't leaving without answers. The road stretched endlessly before him, swallowed by the creeping fingers of night. Nathaniel Carter hadn't set foot on these rural roads in a decade, yet they felt eerily unchanged, just as desolate, just as forgotten. The trees on either side loomed in the darkness, their skeletal branches twisting like grasping hands. His sleek black car sliced through the silence, its headlights the only source of life in a place long abandoned by time. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his pulse an insistent drum in his ears. The letter sat on the passenger seat, its torn edge mocking him with its unfinished warning. There's still time. For what? The mansion loomed in the distance, its silhouette rising against the ink-black sky. Even from here, he could feel it. Something cold, something wrong. The years had not been kind to the estate. The once grand iron gate was rusted and barely clung to its hinges, groaning in protest as he pushed it open. Weeds clawed their way up the stone walls, and ivy choked the balconies where he and Naomi had once played as children. Nathaniel hesitated at the entrance. The air was thick with dust and something else, something he couldn't name but felt deep in his bones. The weight of the past pressed against his chest as he stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards beneath his feet let out a weary sigh. The front door was locked. He had expected that. But the problem was the lock itself. It was new. His breath hitched. No one was supposed to be here. No one had lived in this house for 10 years. And yet, someone had replaced the lock. A chill crept up his spine. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the old set of keys he hadn't touched in a decade. The metal was cold against his palm. He tried one after another until, finally, the third key turned with a soft click. The door swung open, revealing a yawning void. Nathaniel hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. The grand chandelier above was dark, its crystals dulled with age. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor, stirring up remnants of a life long forgotten. He reached for the light switch. Nothing. The electricity had been cut off years ago. A flashlight. He pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight, its beams slicing through the darkness. Shadows stretched and recoiled as he moved forward, illuminating the dust-covered furniture, the portraits hanging askew on the walls, faces of ancestors who had once ruled this house with power and wealth. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. The house was silent, too silent. Then he heard it. A sound, soft, barely there. At first, he thought it was the wind seeping through the cracks in the walls. But no, this was different. It was a whisper of movement, just beyond his line of sight. A shift in the air. The faintest creak of a floorboard. Nathaniel froze. He wasn't alone. His heart pounded as he turned his flashlight toward the hallway. The darkness seemed to deepen, thick and suffocating. His grip tightened around the phone. Hello? His voice was steady, but it carried no warmth. Silence. Then, another sound. Not just one, but multiple. A whisper of footsteps. The rustle of fabric. The sensation of being watched. Nathaniel swallowed hard, his breath shallow. He had come here for answers. But as the darkness around him pulsed with something unseen, something alive, he realized one chilling truth. The past wasn't just waiting for him. It had never left. Nathaniel's grip on his phone tightened as the beam of light swept across the abandoned hallway. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, disturbed by his presence, but nothing else moved. The sound, those faint, ghostly footsteps, had stopped. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. It's just the house settling. That's what logic told him. The mansion was old, its bones weary with time. But deep down, he didn't believe it, because he could feel it. Someone was here, watching, waiting. He forced his feet to move, stepping deeper into the house. The heavy silence pressed against him like a living thing, each step echoing too loudly against the marble floors. His flashlight flickered over familiar sights, grand paintings now dulled by dust, antique furniture draped in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. But something was wrong. Objects weren't where they should have been. The porcelain vase on the mantel, Naomi's favorite, had shifted slightly. The old grandfather clock in the corner, long broken, now displayed a different time. And the biggest sign of all, footprints in the dust. Fresh ones. Nathaniel's pulse quickened. He followed the footprints cautiously, tracing them toward the grand staircase. The wooden steps creaked beneath his weight as he ascended, the flashlight beam stretching ahead like a fragile thread of sanity in the overwhelming dark. At the top of the stairs, he hesitated. The footprints led straight to Naomi's old bedroom. His throat tightened. She had loved this room. He could still picture her here, sprawled on the bed, lost in one of her countless books. It had always smelled of lavender and old paper, a sanctuary within their otherwise rigid household. But now, the air that seeped from beneath the closed door was cold. He reached out, fingers hovering over the doorknob. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then, movement. A shadow, swift and silent, flickered beneath the gap in the doorway. Nathaniel yanked the door open. Nothing. The room was empty. The flashlight beam swept over the walls, the dresser, the faded curtains. Everything was coated in dust, untouched for years, except for one thing. A single envelope sat atop Naomi's nightstand, unopened, its edges yellowed with age. His breath caught in his throat. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was addressed to him. Nathaniel's fingers trembled as he reached for it, slowly lifting the fragile paper. He swallowed hard and slid his thumb under the seal, carefully unfolding the letter inside. The words were hurried, frantic, written in a shaky hand, as if Naomi had been afraid. Nathaniel, if you ever read this, I need you to listen. Don't believe what they told you. Please, you have to come back. There's still time. But don't trust. He blinked. The rest of the letter was missing. The bottom half of the page had been torn away. A chill crept down his spine. Someone had taken it. Someone had deliberately hidden the truth from him. And then, a sound behind him. A quiet, almost imperceptible rustling. Nathaniel turned sharply, the flashlight slicing through the dimly lit room. There, on the nightstand, next to the letter, something he hadn't noticed before. A key. Small, old, tarnished with time. And he knew exactly which door it belonged to. The basement. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The basement had always been locked, forbidden even when they were children. Their father had warned them never to go down there, and as they grew older, they simply accepted it as part of the house's many mysteries. But now, standing in the middle of Naomi's abandoned bedroom, holding a letter that should never have been lost and a key that should never have been left behind, Nathaniel realized something. This house wasn't abandoned. Someone had been living here, and whatever secrets lay waiting in the basement, they weren't meant to be found. Nathaniel stood motionless, the small, tarnished key cold in his palm. The air in Naomi's bedroom felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting. His mind raced. Who had left the letter behind? And more importantly, who had taken the rest of it? He turned the key over in his fingers. The basement, the only locked door in the entire mansion. Growing up, their father had been adamant that neither he nor Naomi ever step foot down there. Some doors are better left closed, he had always said. As children, they had been too frightened to question him. As teenagers, they had lost interest. And as adults, they had left the house behind. But now, something was waiting below. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, forcing his feet to move. He pocketed the key and turned, striding down the hallway with renewed urgency. His flashlight cast long, flickering shadows along the walls as he descended the staircase, his footsteps swallowed by the silence. The basement door stood at the far end of the corridor, partially hidden behind a heavy, dust-laden curtain. It was unremarkable, plain wood, no ornate carvings, no hints of the secrets it guarded. But as he approached, an uneasy sensation coiled in his gut. The handle was ice-cold when he grasped it. For a brief moment, he hesitated. A whisper of childhood fear resurfaced, but he pushed it aside. With a measured breath, he slid the key into the lock. A soft click. The door creaked open. A wall of damp, stale air rushed out to greet him. He coughed, covering his nose as the scent of mildew and rot settled into his lungs. The darkness beyond the threshold was absolute, untouched by even the faintest sliver of moonlight. Nathaniel lifted his flashlight, the beam cutting into the abyss. Stone steps spiraled downward, disappearing into the shadows. He swallowed hard. And then, he heard it. A rustling sound. Faint, but unmistakable. Breathing. Someone was down there. His entire body tensed. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave, to call the police, to do anything but step into that suffocating darkness. But then he saw it. At the base of the stairs, just beyond the reach of his flashlight, a figure. Small. Huddled. A person. Nathaniel's grip tightened around the flashlight. He forced himself to take a step forward, then another. The wooden steps groaned under his weight as he descended, the temperature dropping with each step. The figure didn't move. As he neared the bottom, his light finally revealed them. A girl. Young. No older than 10 or 11. Her pale skin was streaked with dirt, her dark hair tangled and unkempt. She was curled up in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest, trembling. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto his. Nathaniel's heart clenched. She flinched as if expecting him to strike her. "It's okay," he said softly, crouching to her level. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond. "What's your name?" he tried again. She shook her head violently, pressing herself further into the wall as if she could disappear into the stone itself. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. Who was she? How long had she been down here? And who had kept her here? Before he could ask another question, a sudden noise from upstairs made his blood turn to ice. A door slamming. Footsteps. Someone else was in the house. Nathaniel's breath caught. His flashlight flickered wildly as he turned toward the stairs. The girl whimpered. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of whoever was coming. And in that moment, Nathaniel understood something with chilling clarity. He hadn't just stumbled onto an old family secret. He had walked straight into something far more dangerous. And now, there was no turning back. Nathaniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The sound of footsteps above was unmistakable, measured, deliberate. Someone was here. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. He turned to the girl, who had shrunk even further against the cold basement wall, her small frame trembling. Whoever she was, she had been hiding down here for a reason. And judging by her terrified expression, the person upstairs was the reason. Nathaniel forced himself to stay calm. He crouched lower, speaking in a whisper. We need to go. The girl didn't move. We have to go, he urged, glancing back at the stairs. The footsteps were growing louder. Someone was coming closer. Still, she hesitated. Nathaniel clenched his jaw, time slipping away like grains of sand. He reached out carefully, offering his hand. I'm not going to hurt you, he promised. But if we stay here, he will. That made her flinch. For a long moment, she simply stared at his outstretched hand. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached out, her small fingers barely brushing against his. Above them, a door creaked open. Nathaniel felt the shift instantly. The air became charged, thick with something unspoken. His instinct screamed. Whoever just entered the house was looking for them. There was no time. He scooped the girl up in one swift motion. She let out a quiet gasp but didn't resist. Nathaniel pressed himself against the wall, clutching her close as he turned off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed them whole. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs. Nathaniel's breath hitched. A pause. Then, a voice. You shouldn't have come back, Mr. Carter. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. The voice was calm, almost casual. But beneath the surface, there was something else. Something dangerous. Nathaniel tightened his grip on the girl. He didn't recognize the man's voice, but it was clear the stranger knew him. And that terrified him more than anything. The slow creak of the wooden steps made his heart pound. The man was descending. Step by step. Nathaniel's mind raced. He had no weapon. No plan. The girl in his arms was shaking violently, her tiny hands gripping his shirt. He had to think. Fast. His eyes darted around the basement, searching for an escape. The only way out was the stairs, blocked. The walls were solid stone. No hidden doors. Then his gaze landed on the shelves lining the far wall. Old storage racks filled with forgotten relics, dust-covered boxes, and shadows deep enough to hide in. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only one he had. Carefully, silently, he moved. Every step felt impossibly loud in the oppressive stillness. The girl buried her face against his shoulder, suppressing a whimper. The man's footsteps paused. Nathaniel froze. A soft chuckle. You're not very good at hiding. A sharp beam of light cut through the darkness. The man had a flashlight of his own. It swept across the basement, illuminating crates, old furniture, creeping dangerously close to their hiding spot. Nathaniel's pulse roared in his ears. He held his breath. The light moved past them. Silence. Then, click. The sound of a knife flicking open. Nathaniel barely had time to react before the light swung back, catching the briefest glint of metal in the man's hand. I know you're down here, the man said, voice low and mocking. And I know you have the girl. Nathaniel's muscles coiled, every instinct screaming at him to run. But before he could move, the girl did something unexpected. She lifted her head, and in the faintest, smallest voice, she whispered one word. Victor. Nathaniel's stomach dropped. The man on the stairs let out a slow exhale, as if savoring the sound of his own name. Ah, he murmured. So you do remember me, Andrea? Nathaniel felt her fingers dig into his shirt. Andrea. The girl had a name, and from the way she trembled, from the pure, unfiltered terror in her eyes, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Victor wasn't just some stranger. He was her captor, and now, he was here to take her back. Nathaniel's mind raced. Victor. The name lingered in the stale basement air like a curse. Andrea was still trembling in his arms, her body stiff with fear. Whoever this man was, she knew him, and she feared him more than anything. Nathaniel's grip tightened. He had no intention of handing her over. Above them, Victor sighed. The beam of his flashlight swept lazily across the room, his footsteps slow and unhurried, like a predator enjoying the hunt. "I must admit, Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, "I didn't expect you to be so persistent. It's been 10 years. You should have left well enough alone." Nathaniel didn't respond. He could hear Victor moving closer, his boots scuffing against the concrete floor. "I suppose curiosity is a powerful thing," Victor mused. "Or maybe it's guilt. Do you feel guilty, Nathaniel? Do you wonder if you could have saved her?" Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He knew exactly who Victor was talking about. Rachel, his sister. Victor chuckled softly. "I remember Rachel well," he continued. "Beautiful, stubborn, always trying to fight battles she couldn't win." A pause. "Much like you, I imagine." Nathaniel forced himself to remain still. Anger burned in his chest, but rage wouldn't help him now. He needed to be smart, to get Andrea out of here. Victor let out a dramatic sigh. "And now here you are, meddling in things that don't concern you." He took another step forward, the light skimming over the old wooden crates where Nathaniel and Andrea were hidden. Nathaniel's muscles tensed. Then Victor's tone shifted. It became sharper, colder. "But I won't let you take her from me." Andrea flinched in his arms. Victor's light stopped moving. "Andrea," he said, his voice gentle now, coaxing, "come here, sweetheart. You know better than this." Nathaniel could feel her heartbeat pounding against his chest. She was paralyzed with fear. "Come now," Victor pressed. "You know you belong with me." Nathaniel had heard enough. In one swift motion, he scooped Andrea up, pivoted on his heel, and sprinted toward the basement stairs. Victor reacted instantly. "Don't!" A sharp whistle sliced through the air. Then a loud thunk. A knife buried itself into the wooden frame beside Nathaniel's head, missing him by inches. Andrea let out a small cry, but Nathaniel didn't stop. He bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, shoving the door open with his shoulder and slamming it behind him. A heartbeat of silence. Then, bang! Victor threw his full weight against the door, rattling it on its hinges. Nathaniel turned and ran. The mansion was a maze of darkened halls and forgotten rooms, but he didn't hesitate. He had lived here once. He knew the way out. Behind him, Victor's voice rang out, laced with fury. "You think this is over?" His footsteps thundered up the stairs. "You think you can take her from me?" Nathaniel didn't slow. The front door loomed ahead. Just a few more steps. Then something slammed into him from behind. The force sent him crashing to the ground, Andrea tumbling from his arms with a yelp. Nathaniel gritted his teeth as pain exploded across his ribs. Victor had caught up. "Fool!" Victor hissed, pinning Nathaniel down with an iron grip. "You don't understand, do you?" His breath was hot against Nathaniel's ear. "She's mine." Nathaniel growled, twisting beneath him, but Victor was strong. Then, Andrea screamed. Nathaniel's head snapped up just in time to see Victor's hand shoot out, grabbing Andrea by the wrist. "No!" Nathaniel roared. Andrea thrashed wildly, her small fists pounding against Victor's arm. "Let me go." Victor's grip tightened. "Enough." His voice was sharp now, dangerous. "You belong with me, Andrea. You always have." Nathaniel didn't think. He moved. With a surge of strength, he twisted, throwing Victor off balance just enough to roll free. He lunged, grabbing a rusted metal candle holder from a nearby table, and swung. The impact sent Victor staggering back, dazed. Nathaniel didn't wait for him to recover. He grabbed Andrea, hauling her to her feet, and together they ran. The front door. The night air. Freedom. They burst outside, sprinting across the overgrown lawn. Nathaniel didn't stop until they reached his car. He yanked the door open, shoving Andrea inside before diving into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life. In the rearview mirror, Victor stood on the porch, his silhouette illuminated by the dim porch light. He didn't chase them. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply smiled. And as Nathaniel sped away, his pulse still hammering, he realized something chilling. Victor wasn't worried, because in his mind, this wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Nathaniel drove in silence, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement did little to calm the storm raging inside him. Andrea sat curled up in the passenger seat, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her wide eyes darting between him and the dark road ahead. The mansion had faded into the night behind them, but Nathaniel knew they weren't truly safe. Not yet. Victor had let them go too easily. Nathaniel had seen it in his eyes. The smug confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. A man who knew something Nathaniel didn't. "We're going somewhere safe," Nathaniel said finally, breaking the tense silence. "I promise." Andrea didn't respond. She only nodded slightly, but the way her fingers dug into her sleeves betrayed the fear still gripping her. Nathaniel glanced at her, guilt twisting in his chest. She was too young to have been trapped there for long, but how long had she been living under Victor's control? And how had Rachel, his sister, managed to hide her existence from him? He had questions, and he would get answers. But first, he needed help. They reached the city an hour later. Nathaniel pulled into an underground parking lot beneath a sleek, modern building and cut the engine. Andrea sat stiffly, hesitant to move. "We're meeting someone," he told her gently. "Someone who can help us." Still, she hesitated. Nathaniel sighed, softening his voice. "Andrea, I know you don't trust me yet, and I don't blame you, but I will keep you safe." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but then she only gave a small, hesitant nod. That was enough for now. He led her inside, taking a private elevator to the 11th floor. The hallway was quiet, lined with sleek office doors. Nathaniel stopped in front of one marked David Morgan, private investigator. He knocked once. The door swung open almost immediately. David Morgan was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a weary expression that suggested he'd seen more than his fair share of the world's darkness. "Nate," he greeted gruffly. Then his gaze flickered to Andrea. A brief pause, just long enough to register surprise, before he stepped aside. "Come in." Nathaniel ushered Andrea inside, shutting the door behind them. The office was neat but unpretentious, papers scattered across the desk, an old coffee cup sitting on a filing cabinet. David gestured to the chairs. "Sit." Andrea hesitated but obeyed. Nathaniel remained standing, his arms crossed. "I need answers." David leaned back against his desk, arms folded. "So I gathered. You don't usually show up at this hour unless something's burning down." His sharp eyes studied Andrea again. "Who's the kid?" Nathaniel took a slow breath. "Her name is Andrea," he said, "and I think she's Rachel's daughter." David's entire body stiffened. Silence hung heavy in the air. "Come again?" Nathaniel ran a hand down his face. "I don't have all the details yet, but I found her in the mansion. In the basement. Victor had her." David swore under his breath. "That bastard," he muttered. He turned his attention back to Andrea, his voice gentler. "How old are you, kid?" Andrea hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, 10. David and Nathaniel exchanged a look. 10. Rachel had disappeared 10 years ago. There was no denying it now. Andrea wasn't just some child Victor had taken in. She was Rachel's daughter, and that meant Rachel had never left. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "Victor lied to me. Rachel never went to France. She was trapped in that house." He clenched his jaw. "And now she's gone." David ran a hand through his graying hair. "Damn it, Nate." He shook his head, thinking, "Victor must have faked those letters she sent you." He covered his tracks well. Nathaniel's hands curled into fists. "I want the truth. Every piece of it." David nodded. "Then we start digging." He moved to his desk, rifling through a folder before pulling out a thick file. I did some research on Victor a few years back, when you first asked about Rachel's disappearance. He tossed it onto the table. Nothing concrete back then, but I had a bad feeling about the guy. Nathaniel grabbed the file and flipped it open. Photographs, documents, surveillance notes. Victor had been Rachel's caretaker, managing the estate after their parents passed. But in the years following her disappearance, he had slowly tightened his grip on the mansion, ensuring it remained untouched, locked away like a tomb. Rachel trusted him, Nathaniel murmured, his throat tight. She thought he was a friend. David snorted. Yeah? Well, he had other ideas. He tapped a grainy surveillance photo. A shot of Victor in the city, 10 years ago, entering a hospital. This was taken shortly after Rachel disappeared. My guess? She was still alive back then, and probably pregnant. Nathaniel's chest ached. Rachel had been alive. Alive? And he had done nothing. He shook off the guilt. Now wasn't the time. He turned to Andrea. Do you remember anything about your mother? Andrea hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Then, finally, she whispered, she used to read to me at night. Nathaniel swallowed hard. David's voice was softer now. Andrea, do you know what happened to her? A long silence. Then, quietly, she said, Victor told me she left, that she didn't want me. Her voice wavered. But I don't think that's true. Nathaniel crouched beside her chair, his voice steady. It's not. Your mother loved you. Andrea's lips trembled, but she didn't cry. David exhaled. All right. If Victor's been keeping her hidden this long, he'd help. We need to find out who. Nathaniel nodded. And we need to get legal custody of Andrea before Victor tries to take her back. David smirked. You think Victor's gonna play by the rules? Nathaniel's expression hardened. No, because Victor wasn't done. And Nathaniel knew. This fight had only just begun. Nathaniel barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed the horror of what he had uncovered. Andrea, Rachel's daughter, his niece, a child raised in captivity, fed lies about the mother who had fought for her. And Rachel, who had never left. The truth clawed at him like a wild animal, refusing to let him rest. He needed to know everything. By morning, David had already begun his investigation, pulling every record, contact, and lead he could find. But there was one place Nathaniel knew he had to search himself. The mansion. Rachel's study. If she had left behind any trace of the truth, it would be there. Nathaniel returned to the estate just before sundown. He parked his car some distance away, keeping a low profile in case Victor was watching. The thought of facing that monster again sent a cold rage through his veins, but tonight, he wasn't here for Victor. He was here for Rachel. The mansion loomed in the fading light, its once grand exterior now a decaying relic of the past. The windows were dark, empty like the hollow eyes of a corpse. But as Nathaniel stepped onto the porch, a strange sense of familiarity washed over him, like stepping into a memory long buried. He pushed the door open. Silence greeted him. He moved swiftly through the house, his footsteps echoing against the dust-covered floors. He passed the grand staircase, the portraits lining the hall, his parents, Rachel, and himself, frozen in time. Then he reached Rachel's study. The door creaked as he pushed it open. The air inside was thick, undisturbed for years. Books lined the shelves. The mahogany desk stood precisely as he remembered it. But something was off. The room wasn't just abandoned. It was arranged. Nathaniel scanned the space, his instincts prickling. If Rachel had been desperate, hiding something from Victor, where would she put it? He stepped toward the desk, fingers trailing along its surface. The drawers were locked, but that wasn't what caught his attention. It was the books. One shelf, in particular, looked wrong. He reached forward, pulling at one of the heavier volumes. It didn't budge. His heart pounded. He pressed harder, until finally, with a soft click, the entire section of the bookshelf shifted. A hidden compartment. Inside, tucked behind the false panel, was an old leather-bound journal. Rachel's. Nathaniel exhaled sharply and pulled it free, his hands shaking as he flipped it open. The handwriting was unmistakable. Rachel's delicate script covered the pages, the ink faded but still legible. He began to read. At first, the entries were ordinary. Notes about the estate, frustrations with Victor's growing possessiveness, musings about their parents' legacy. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. I feel trapped in my own home. Nathaniel's grip tightened. Victor is watching me. Every decision I make, every letter I write, it all goes through him first. I thought he was my friend. I was wrong. A shiver ran down Nathaniel's spine. He turned another page. I'm pregnant. He froze. The ink was smudged as if Rachel had written it with a shaking hand. I don't know what to do. I was going to tell Nathaniel. I should have. But Victor, he knows. He won't let me leave. He keeps telling me it's for my own good, that the world outside isn't safe. But I see the way he looks at me, the way he talks about the baby. My baby. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. I tried to leave today. He stopped me, said I was being foolish, that I was making things worse. I don't believe him. I need to get out. I need to get Andrea out. Andrea. Nathaniel turned the pages faster now, desperate for the last entry. He won't let me leave. He won't let me go. I don't know how much longer I have before he takes everything from me. If anyone finds this, if Nathaniel ever finds this, please tell my daughter I love her. Tell her I never stopped fighting. And then, nothing. Nathaniel stared at the final words, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Rachel never left. She never had a chance. He closed the journal. His jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Victor had taken everything from her. But now, Nathaniel had proof. He had Rachel's words, and he was going to make Victor pay. Nathaniel sat in his car, gripping Rachel's journal so tightly his knuckles turned white. The words burned in his mind. Rachel's last cries for help, her fear, her desperation. Every second spent in that house had been a prison for her, and Victor had been the warden. But now, Nathaniel had proof. He wasn't just going to expose the truth. He was going to end this nightmare. The next morning, Nathaniel met David in a downtown cafe. The investigator looked up from his notes as Nathaniel slid the journal across the table. Read the last few entries, Nathaniel said. His voice was low, simmering with barely contained rage. David flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each line. By the time he reached the end, he let out a slow exhale. Jesus! She never left, Nathaniel muttered. She never ran away. He kept her there. Until he couldn't finish the sentence. David leaned back, rubbing his jaw. This changes everything. If we can prove Victor kept her prisoner, we can have him arrested. But we need more than just the journal. We need something solid. Evidence, a confession, anything that can hold up in court. Nathaniel's mind raced. We need to get Andrea out first. Then we make our move. David nodded. I have a plan for that. That afternoon, a legal document was sent to Victor Clark's address. A notice claiming ownership disputes over the Pierce estate. The letter, forged with expert precision, demanded Victor's presence in the city courthouse the following morning to settle the claim. Nathaniel watched from a distance as Victor stormed out of the mansion, looking furious. He shoved the letter into his pocket, climbed into his car, and sped off toward the city. The trap was set. It was time to get Andrea out. Night fell. Nathaniel and David arrived at the estate, their approach swift and silent. The house stood in eerie darkness, abandoned for now. They moved quickly, slipping inside through the back door. Basement, Nathaniel whispered. David nodded, his hand resting on the small pistol holstered at his hip. He wasn't expecting a fight, but he was prepared for one. Nathaniel led the way, navigating through the familiar halls. His pulse pounded as he reached the basement door. He knocked twice, then paused. A soft rustle from within. Andrea, he whispered. It's me, Nathaniel. Silence. Then, the lock clicked from the inside. The door creaked open just a crack, and wide, frightened eyes peered out. Andrea. Nathaniel's heart twisted at the sight of her. Still so frail, so unsure. We're getting you out of here, he said gently. She hesitated. He said, no one would ever come for me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Nathaniel crouched down, meeting her eyes. Your mother never stopped fighting for you, he said. Now it's my turn. Andrea swallowed hard, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. But then, slowly, hesitantly, she placed her small, trembling hand in his. Nathaniel squeezed it tightly. "Let's go." They moved swiftly through the mansion, heading toward the back door. Freedom was just steps away when a sound, a car engine. Nathaniel's blood turned ice cold. Victor was back. David cursed under his breath. He wasn't supposed to return yet. Nathaniel pushed Andrea behind him. "We don't have time. Go out the side entrance now." David nodded, leading Andrea toward another exit. Nathaniel turned toward the front, knowing he had to stall Victor long enough for them to escape. The front door slammed open. Victor stood in the doorway, his face a twisted mask of fury. Nathaniel clenched his fists. This was it. The moment Victor stepped through the front door, Nathaniel knew there was no turning back. The dim glow of the hallway light cast eerie shadows over the man's face, his eyes dark with suspicion. He hadn't expected to find an intruder in his house, let alone Nathaniel Pierce standing defiantly in his path. Victor's lips curled into a slow, mocking smile. Well, look who decided to come home." Nathaniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he kept his voice even. "It's over, Victor." Victor shut the door behind him with an unsettling sense of control. "Over?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Nathaniel. It's just beginning." Without warning, he lunged. Nathaniel barely had time to brace himself before Victor's body slammed into him, sending them both crashing into a side table. The impact rattled through his ribs, but he gritted his teeth, shoving Victor off. The older man stumbled back, but his eyes were wild, filled with something almost maniacal. "You had no right to come here," Victor snarled. "This is my house, my life. And his voice cracked with rage, she belonged to me." Nathaniel's stomach twisted with disgust. "Rachel was never yours," he spat. "And neither is Andrea." Victor's face contorted in fury. He reached into his coat, and in a flash, the glint of a knife caught the dim light. Nathaniel reacted on instinct, dodging the first wild slash, but pain ripped through his side as the blade grazed him, a searing burn just above his ribs. He stumbled back, clutching the wound, warm blood seeping through his fingers. Victor loomed over him, panting. "You should have left this alone, Nathaniel." Nathaniel's vision blurred, but through the haze of pain, movement caught his eye. Andrea. She stood at the far end of the hall, her small figure trembling. But something had changed in her expression. She wasn't just afraid anymore. She was angry. Nathaniel saw it. The moment the truth shattered through the years of Victor's lies. Andrea's hands clenched into fists. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice raw with betrayal. Victor stiffened. "Andrea." "You lied," she said louder, stepping forward, her small voice growing stronger. "You said my mother left us, but she didn't. You took her away." Victor's breath hitched. I gave you a home." "No," Andrea cut him off, her voice steady now. "You stole mine." The air in the room shifted. For the first time, Victor Clark looked afraid. His grip on the knife faltered, just slightly, but it was enough. Nathaniel saw his opening. With a sharp, desperate motion, he lunged, slamming into Victor with all his strength. The force sent the older man stumbling backward, his head colliding with the wooden banister behind him. The knife clattered to the floor. Victor groaned, dazed, but before he could recover, David burst through the side door, gun drawn. "Don't move," David ordered. Nathaniel sucked in a sharp breath, clutching his wound as Victor's body sagged against the staircase. For a moment, silence filled the room, except for Andrea's ragged breathing. Nathaniel turned to her. "It's over." Andrea's eyes darted between him and Victor's motionless form. She hesitated, then ran straight into Nathaniel's arms, her small frame shaking. Nathaniel held her tight, his free hand smoothing over her tangled hair. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I promise." Behind them, sirens howled in the distance. Justice was coming. The night was thick with tension, the flashing lights of police sirens casting eerie shadows against the decaying walls of the mansion. Rain from the earlier storm still clung to the earth, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and mildew. Inside, Nathaniel stood in the grand foyer, his body rigid as he watched the scene unfold around him. Officers moved swiftly through the house, their voices sharp and precise as they documented every dark secret hidden within these walls. The weight of it all pressed down on him. The years of silence, the pain his sister had endured, the injustice of it all. But now, the past was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was being dragged into the light. Victor Clark stood in the center of it all, his hands cuffed behind his back, his posture eerily relaxed despite the chaos around him. Even now, he held that same smug expression, as if he were still in control. His voice, calm and unsettling, cut through the noise. "You don't understand what you've done, Ellis," he said smoothly, his eyes locking onto Nathaniel's. "You think you're saving her, but you've only made things worse." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had spent the past 10 years haunted by questions, by a grief he could never make sense of. And now, standing face to face with the man responsible for it all, he felt nothing but cold fury. But before he could speak, David stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the dim light. "Get him out of here," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officers moved swiftly, dragging Victor toward the exit. As they did, Andrea stood frozen near the staircase, her wide eyes following every movement. She had spent her entire life believing no one would ever come for her, that the world beyond these walls didn't exist for her. Now, watching Victor being led away, she trembled, not in fear, but in disbelief. Nathaniel turned to her, his expression softening. "It's over," he said quietly, but was it truly over? The truth of Rachel's fate still loomed over them like an unfinished sentence. As police continued their search of the house, one of the officers called out, "Sir, you need to see this." Nathaniel and David followed the officer through the narrow hallway leading to what had once been Rachel's private quarters. The room was just as he had left it, the scent of old paper and faded perfume lingering in the air. But now, with the police combing through every inch, hidden truths began to surface. Behind the bookshelf, concealed beneath layers of dust and neglect, they found records, journals, notes, documents that painted a horrifying picture. Rachel had never left. She had never escaped. She had been trapped here, suffering under Victor's control, writing her last words in desperate hope that someone would one day find them. Nathaniel's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, his sister's handwriting growing weaker with each entry. The final words, written in uneven strokes, sent a chill down his spine. "If anyone finds this, please tell my brother. I never stopped fighting for her." Andrea stood beside him, staring at the words as if they were a foreign language. She was here? Her voice was barely a whisper. "She didn't leave me?" Nathaniel swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "She never left you," he said. "She fought for you until the very end." A broken sob escaped Andrea's lips as she pressed her hands over her mouth. Years of lies, of manipulation, shattered in an instant. Victor had told her Rachel abandoned her, that she was unwanted. But the truth was far different. The truth was that her mother had loved her more than anything. The night stretched on as police continued their search, gathering evidence, unraveling every sinister thread of the past. As dawn approached, Nathaniel stepped outside, breathing in the cold morning air. He had come back to this house seeking closure, but instead, he had uncovered a horror that could never truly be erased. Yet, for the first time in 10 years, he felt something other than grief. He felt purpose. Justice had been served, but now came the most important part, helping Andrea build a life beyond these walls. 2 days later, the news broke. Victor Clark was found dead in his prison cell, the official report ruling it as a suicide. Nathaniel didn't waste time mourning a monster. His focus remained on Andrea, on the future she had been robbed of. The past had finally ended. Now, it was time to begin again. The past month had been a whirlwind of emotions, grief, healing, and quiet moments of uncertainty. The mansion, once a looming symbol of secrets and suffering, had been stripped of its horrors, left to decay as a relic of a time long buried. But for Nathaniel and Andrea, The ghosts of that place still lingered, not in the walls, but in the wounds that would take far longer to heal. Nathaniel had made sure Andrea had everything she needed. A safe place to stay, therapy sessions with a trusted counselor, and even small steps into the outside world. For the first time, she was allowed to choose what she wanted to eat, what clothes she wanted to wear, where she wanted to go. It was a strange feeling for her, being given choices. Some days, she barely spoke. Other days, she asked endless questions about the world she had never been allowed to know. But there was one decision she had yet to make: the adoption. Nathaniel had made it clear from the start. He wasn't here to replace anyone. He wasn't forcing her into anything. But he wanted her to know that if she wanted a family, a real one, she had it with him. The papers had been sitting on the lawyer's desk for 2 weeks now, untouched, waiting for her. And now, here they were. The office was quiet, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and fresh ink. A large window let in the golden afternoon light, casting long shadows across the desk where the documents lay, crisp and waiting. Nathaniel sat across from Andrea, his hands folded, his expression calm but patient. She sat stiffly in the chair, staring at the papers as if they might disappear if she looked away long enough. "You don't have to do this," Nathaniel said softly, breaking the silence. Andrea swallowed, gripping the edge of the chair. "And if I don't?" "Then nothing changes," he assured her. "You still have a place to stay, and I'll still be here. This isn't about obligation, Andrea. This is about what you want." Her fingers traced the corner of the document, her mind racing. Want. That was a strange word to her. She had spent so much of her life being told what to do, what to be, where to stay. She had never been given the luxury of choice. She looked up at Nathaniel, studying him. In the past month, he had never once pushed her. He had never demanded anything, never made her feel like a burden. He had been patient, kind, and unwavering in his support. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Andrea's chest tightened. She had spent years in the darkness of that mansion, believing no one would ever come for her, believing she would die there, forgotten, just like her mother. But then Nathaniel had arrived. He had shattered the lie Victor had forced upon her. He had shown her the truth, that her mother had never abandoned her, that someone had been willing to fight for her, even if it had taken 10 long years. And now, for the first time in her life, she had a choice. She picked up the pen, her hands trembling. She hesitated only for a moment before pressing the tip to the paper and signing her name in careful, deliberate strokes. A silence stretched between them as Nathaniel took the pen next, his signature sealing the promise he had made to her. When he looked up, Andrea was watching him, her blue eyes filled with something new, something he had not seen in her before. Relief. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Nathaniel smiled, warmth filling his gaze. "Now, we go home." Andrea let out a slow breath, as if releasing the last remnants of fear that had held her captive for so long. She wasn't sure what the future held. She wasn't sure if the nightmares would ever fully fade, or if she would ever feel truly normal. But for the first time, she had something she had never dared to believe in before: a second chance. They stepped out of the office together, the city stretching out before them, alive and full of possibilities. The crisp autumn air brushed against her skin as the golden light bathed the streets. Everything felt bigger, brighter, overwhelming in a way she wasn't sure she would ever get used to. Nathaniel walked beside her, a steady presence, neither rushing her nor holding her back. He gave her space but stayed close enough that she knew she wasn't alone. Andrea took a deep breath, letting the reality of it all settle in. No more locked doors. No more whispered lies. No more shadows of the past holding her captive. She looked up at Nathaniel, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Nathaniel chuckled. "I think the better question is, are you?" Andrea hesitated, but then, for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. Not a small, uncertain smile, but a real one, the kind that reached her eyes. "Yeah," she said softly, "I think I am." And with that, they walked forward, side by side, into a future that was finally, truly theirs. Thank you for watching and listening to the full story. I truly appreciate you taking the time to experience this journey with Nathaniel and Andrea. Their story of resilience, truth, and second chances is one that I hope touched your heart as much as it did mine. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. Your engagement means the world and helps bring more immersive and thrilling stories to life. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the ending. Would you like to see more stories like this? Your feedback and support keep this storytelling journey going strong. Thank you once again, and see you in the next story.